Welcome to another episode of What Happened, the world's greatest detective show that, well, I mean, we're pretty up there. No? Okay, well, I'm just saying that it's solid. Anyway, we have a wild one locked and loaded today, folks. It's a confusing tale of dual development, added and then canceled console ports, delays, miscommunication, broken promises, and dead parents. Dead parents. So strap on your utility belt and grab whatever Bat-branded items you have on hand. It's time to find out what happened to Batman Dark Tomorrow. One of, if not possibly the worst Batman game ever made. Between 1997 and 2005, cinematic adaptations of the Caped Crusaders' exploits suddenly stopped coming out, with little to no reason as to why.
No one knows what it's like to be the Batman.
To take up the slack, DC Comics made sure to sign off on as many Batman games as humanly possible in that same 8-year time frame. Almost 10 different titles were released on various platforms, mostly revolving around the Dini-verse. One of these games was Batman Beyond: Return of the Joker, a monotonous button masher which released on both the PS1 and N64, with neither of them being very good at all. It was published by Ubisoft during their wilder days when they put out games that weren't just, this. A phenomena which you can learn about in this video here. Now, Batman Beyond was actually developed by Kemco Japan, best known for publishing, not developing, that was Gremlin Graphics, the Top Gear series. Then what was something they did develop? Why, Daikatana ports, and the shockingly prolific Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle games, of course. So it's pretty evident that Kemco was kinda all over the place. Now, the interesting thing about this era of video games, and particularly licensed video games, is that it was very much a free-for-all. Anybody could license Batman for anything, even if someone else had the rights to him. So if you're making games based on the cartoons like Ubisoft was, that wouldn't stop Kemco from putting bats into other games, as long as it was based on a different version of the character. So that's exactly what they did in 2001. A big shiny press release went out announcing Kemco were publishing and developing a brand new ambitious Batman game subtitled Dark Tomorrow. And it was going to be an exclusive for the almighty
GameCube.
The original intent was for a fully open world Gotham, where Batman could get behind the wheel of the Batmobile, the Batwing, the Batboat, or the Bat-Segway and fight it out with various criminals from his rogues gallery. Okay, so I have successfully fulfilled the requirement of using the term Rogues Gallery in a Batman video. The story of Dark Tomorrow was handled by Scott Peterson, fresh off his run on Batman Gotham Adventures, and who then moved up into the Batman Liaison office for DC at that time. Basically, whenever a company would want to use the character for video games, a bubble bath, or contraceptives, Scott would often need to oversee it. Now, in terms of the nitty-gritty, the programming and design and whatnot, well, that's a bit of a mystery that we're going to clear up, as there has been some misinformation out there. A studio by the name of HotGen often gets credited as the main studio, which really isn't accurate. They were a late addition to the project and were something more of a support studio for Kemco, who were indeed the ones behind the programming and design of Dark Tomorrow. HotGen were based in the UK, and if you haven't heard of them, what's wrong with you? They're behind some of the biggest licenses of the day. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, Indiana Jones, and even Star Wars. For Game Boy handheld systems, of course. Honestly, for them to have to suddenly step up and assist in a sprawling Batman console game was a big change, but they had to start somewhere. The main thing that they were hired to do was to port the GameCube code over to the Xbox. Wait, what? This is because in March of 2002, despite being initially announced as a GameCube exclusive, Kemco then walked that back by adding both Xbox and PS2 versions into the mix, which I'm sure made certain Cube warriors very happy. The game's final release date was also announced. December 2002. Mark your calendar, man. Dark Tomorrow's coming. Now, the reasoning behind this change is not confirmed, but it's assumed that the strong sales base that the PS2 had already built, plus the early success of the Xbox, made Kemco feel that adding more SKUs was the best way for the game to see success, as they viewed the license as their big ticket into Western markets. Now, that's a bit weird, but going back on previous exclusive announcements is not unfounded in the video game industry. Just ask Capcom. Yeah, RE4 jokes, people. But you know what's even weirder? Batman Dark Tomorrow was directed by one of the creators of Final Fantasy. Yes, Kenji Terada, the writer of Fantasies 1, 2, and 3, these ones, bounced between various companies in the 1990s. Most notably, he worked on the Sega CD classic Dark Wizard. God, this box art is just burned into my mind for some reason. I didn't even own a Sega CD! Before finally arriving at Kemco come the turn of the century. So yeah, that is a bit weird. Now, even though Scott Peterson is credited as the main writer, Terada also has a story credit, but it's not exactly clear what the extent of his involvement truly was. As of the airing of this video, Mr. Terada has yet to return my emails. But do you know who did return my emails? Well, that would be Dave Vout, who worked on the game during his time at HotGen and who can certainly dispel some of the gloomy clouds behind Dark Tomorrow. Where do I start? I mean, no disrespect to the team or the management, by the way. They're very nice people and very respectful. However, Kemco had a producer and he built a team spread across the world, way before it became common to do so. There was a team in LA, London, as well as us, Germany, and Japan, multiple locations. Music was being recorded in London in downtime by the Royal Philharmonic, so the game had great cutscenes and production value, but no gameplay. Basically, I think Yuki was making a movie and seeing his IMDb, it makes sense. The basic things, like the in-game camera, just hadn't been addressed. So Yuki Takafumi. This was his first video game producing role, and it seemingly was his last video game producing role. And yeah, if you take a quick look at his IMDb, it's stuffed to the gills with various TV and movie credits, so it's pretty clear where his aspirations actually laid. Now, as stated before, HotGen's main role here was to port Batman Dark Tomorrow over to the Xbox, and in the 6th generation, that process usually started when the main version, in this case the GameCube, was in beta, or at least alpha. Dave told me that when they were hired, Dark Tomorrow was barely even that. Kemco was struggling with a lot of aspects of the game, and that's probably due to the fact that they realized they simply didn't have the time or experience to make a fully open world Batman adventure with multiple vehicles a reality. It's most likely they started scaling everything back and mixing and matching various pieces of the game into a giant Gotham-sized jigsaw puzzle. This was the version that HotGen was presented with after they had signed on to the project. The rooftops became a clunky platforming section. The open streets of Gotham turned into one of the biggest, most confusing areas of the game. Then there's the sewers, Arkham, all of it was repurposed into their own separate levels. Now, while this is certainly a messy way of doing things, it was absolutely the right call, because if Kemco did try to brute force the original open world design, they'd still be developing it today, or more likely it would have been canceled altogether. Under the hood, or cowl, I should say, there were even more problems buried deep within the code, and it's here where I'll let Mr. Vout deliver another doozy. I was taken straight to the Kemco offices and walked into a meeting. Odd thing with the culture there was that everyone had to buy into an idea, so each idea took more than an hour to get everyone to agree to. This turned into me acting as a gameplay designer to get the GameCube version finished so we could then start the Xbox version. Meanwhile, our team was investigating the game code, which was done in Japanese, which didn't help, but they soon discovered that all the AI in the game was actually running in a GBA emulator. It turned out the Dark Tomorrow team had been the GBA team, and as the culture was to not let people go, they had been moved onto GameCube, and for some reason it made sense to them to make a GBA emulator and build the core game in that. I suspect maybe they had started a GBA version and that's what they had been moved from. So that explains probably why much of Dark Tomorrow plays like this. So, obviously there was a disconnect between Kemco and DC, and along with the rushed production schedule, it all led to one of, if not the game's most infamous moment. There are two possible endings players can earn in Darkman Tomorrow Bat. One bad, and one just slightly less bad. All it takes is for a player to miss an easily missable button in the final area, and then they are locked out of getting the best ending. The problem was that you were given absolutely zero indication or hint that this was even a thing. The lack of any sort of text message or dialogue letting you know how important this button is wasn't implemented in time before the game's Gold Master went out for the GameCube and Xbox. Or, they just forgot it altogether. Wait, hold on. Wait, yeah, there it is. What happened to the PS2 version? Well, by the time Hot Gen was hired, it no longer even existed, with Kemco having dropped it altogether at some point in 2002. The only thing we can assume here is that since the GameCube and Xbox were pretty similar in terms of power and such, it would be then the fastest, easiest thing to just focus on those two consoles, rather than continue to struggle with the PS double ballin'. And even if they did want to push it, the development teams were already stretched pretty thin as it was, since neither company was particularly large in terms of manpower. Thus, on a cold, dreary night in Gotham, the PS2 port left the theater a little bit early, and was met with a sudden and violent end in the alleys of Crime Alley. It's clear that Kemco was out of their depth here, and to cement that, we need to swing back around with Scott Peterson, who detailed a particular instance of culture clash on the Comics on Consoles podcast. He recalled that early on in the game's life, a physical meeting took place between Kemco and DC with a translator to hash out the game. Kemco started outlining their ideas for a particular moment that would occur when Batman sneaks into Arkham Asylum. To distract the guards, Batman whips out a boombox and starts playing salsa music, and the guards get distracted, so distracted by the dancing that he's able to sneak past them. So did we have some idea that there was perhaps a bit of a train wreck on the way? I think it's safe to say we knew pretty early on that there wasn't a complete and total simpatico Vulcan mind meld going on. And a complete total train wreck is what followed. After a delay from December 2002 to March 2003, most likely due to the fact that the game just really actually needed the extra time, Dark Tomorrow lurched onto the GameCube and Xbox with a wet, dank bat fart. Aside from a comic book promotion with DC, the game didn't really have much of a marketing campaign, mostly because, according to Dave Vout, Kemco had burned through most of their money on the actual development. This isn't surprising. What with the CG cutscenes, the Philharmonic Orchestra, multiple studios, it all amounted to a costly misfire for the company. So, without the luxury of a robust marketing strategy, they would just have to rely on word of mouth, which Reviews for Dark Tomorrow were pretty savage and were spread fairly equally across critics and most anyone with a pulse and a head, I guess. In fact, if you look it up, Bats is only a few narrow points above Superman 64's review average, so it's definitely the low point for Bruce Wayne. Well, except for maybe, yeah. Then, just a few short years after this debacle, Kemco's US branch was completely shut down to save costs, right after Chicago Enforcer and Rogue Ops failed to generate much of, well, anything in the sales charts. Their main Japanese branch, not to be outdone, was also forced to drastically pivot. This pivoting resulted in them abandoning console gaming just cold turkey and completely transitioned to Japanese-only mobile games. Nowadays, they routinely pump out several of these and a deluge of DLC every single month like clockwork, with titles such as Alphadia Genesis, Crystal Ortha, and of course, Ass Divine. It's actually kinda crazy that only 2 short years later, EA and Eurocom were able to capitalize on the Dark Knight's rebounding cinematic popularity with their adaptation of Batman Begins, before some other mildly successful Batman games came out later on. I don't really remember what they were. So if you think about it from a different perspective, Kemco was way ahead of their time with Dark Tomorrow, what with using tons of gadgets, a mature storyline, and diving deep into the bowels of Arkham Asylum. But wait, no, it's actually the reverse of that. They weren't ahead of their... Nah, they just messed up. What happened to Hot Gen, you ask? Well, they lingered on until about 2014, amazingly, with their only post-Batman game of note being Star Wars Republic Squadron, which, if you don't remember, you'll be forgiven, because it released exclusively on this thing. Whew, make no mistake, Dark Tomorrow was a beautiful disaster. A developer/publisher who had aspirations of greatness, were given one of the most mainstream, globally recognized characters of all time, but were ill-equipped to deliver on their vision even with help, and wound up delivering one of the worst, most infamous comic book video games in history. As for our friend Dave Vout, well, he's doing just fine at Deep Silver Dam Busters, so good on him, and it's with this final thought of his that we'll leave on. Hot Gen were desperate to get on with the port, so there was a lot of pressure on me to do what I could with very little time and then move on. So I did, and it broke my heart to leave it like that. We got the game finished eventually. No one is proud of it, but it got finished, and that was harder than it looked. But why do we fall, Bruce?
So that we can learn to pick ourselves up.
If you know of any other horrendously horrible superhero hack jobs, let me know in the comments below or over on my Twitter. And if you want to directly nominate a subject of your choosing, then bat grapple over to the Flophouse VIP Patreon and become a big boss to put forward what we'll be tackling next. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned until next week. Same What Happened time, same What Happened channel.